Hello, happy Wednesday with this Wednesday word. Hello, thank you so much for joining me on this last day of November of 2022. It has been quite an adventurous year, quite an adventurous season that we've been in. So thank you so much for those who will join me and who are joining me. I really do appreciate you spending this time with me. I'm gonna go ahead and forewarn you, today's message is gonna be longer than 10 minutes, but it should be hopefully probably 15, no more than 20. But this message is something that's very personal to me. So I ask you to bear with me as I kind of go through it. I'm going to be giving some personal examples from my own life with this particular word. And specifically, this word actually came from a sermon that it didn't come from, but it was inspired by a sermon that my pastor gave. So I want to encourage you, for those of you who want to explore or even learn more about grief and what grief looks like, and that's what the topic of today's topic is going to be for the Wednesday word. I encourage you to go to Disciple Central Community Church. We're in DeSoto, and he preached a sermon this past Sunday called Good Morning, and morning being MOURNING. And so it was such a great sermon, especially for those who've experienced any type of loss. I think that everyone in the audience or in the congregation on Sunday who had experienced loss, especially the death of a loved one, the death of ideals, just anything, we were so moved by it, because I appreciated it, because he didn't talk about grief just from a high level standpoint. He really talked about the process of grief, and people don't understand that it's a process. One of the things I learned during my training with counseling and as a counselor was, people talk about the different stages of grief and what those look like. But people don't understand that they're not necessarily just stages that follow one after another, that they can be intertwined, and you can experience one over here and then experience something over here. So you can experience acceptance and then anger and then go back to denial. And it's a circular journey what grief is, and as far as the process is. And so I really appreciated that sermon, but from that sermon, it really made me reflect upon my own journey of grief and what I've experienced in my life. And then also just where I'm at right now. While he was preaching this sermon, there was such a sense of peace in my heart on Sunday. And there was many times that I smiled, because I recognized that I had gone through the process and I had come out on the other side, and that I was transformed by much of my grief. And so that's what brought me to today's message. And today's message, the title of the message I'm bringing to you is Broken: When God Uses Grief to Nurture and to Transform You. And I'm going to be reading from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4 through 13. This is a lot of scriptures that I'm going to be reading. But I really want you to look at all of 1 Kings chapter 19. Because I'm not going to be able to cover everything, the nuances of it. Some parts of it I'm going to be summarizing. But when we kind of deep dive into this particular text and how it ties into grief. So thank you so much again for joining me. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to be reading again from 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 4 through 13. And I'm reading from the NRSV version. And so it starts out saying, but he himself, is referencing the prophet Elijah. And so it says, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, get up and eat. He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, get up. Otherwise, the journey will be too much for you. He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of the food of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then when the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" he answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I am alone, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." The Lord was talking to Elijah here. And so now there was a great wind so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. The Lord was not. So my alarm just went off my medicine. But the Lord was not in the wind, and so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, the silence, he wrapped his face in the mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And so I want to just go ahead and just dive deep into this text of what it means to be broken when God uses your grief to nurture and to transform you. And so what does this story have to do with grief, and how does it tie into grief? So one of the many things when people talk about this story, they're referencing the depression that Elijah was experiencing at this point. He had just come from the pinnacle of what many would deem success when he went up against the false prophets, and when he went up against Jezebel and all of those that were going against him and going against God. And at that journey, though, when all of the things happened, and when God smote all of the false prophets and all of even Elijah's contemporaries had been killed, Elijah was such at a point that he ran away. He ran away to a state of depression, but so much so that he wanted to actually die. And so what does this again have to do with grief? Well, several different ways. You know, most people, when they think of grief, they think of grief as the death of a person, the physical death. But grief can actually manifest itself when the death of an ideal, the death of a relationship, the loss of status, the loss of purpose, the loss of job. Grief and loss is not just dedicated to actual physical death. So Elijah had gone from a pinnacle moment in his life to such a bottom and rock bottom. He had lost friends, his contemporaries. He had lost what his status was as a prophet. He had lost so many different things. And so he was at the point that he actually wanted to just go ahead and be done with life. But for today, I want to share again from a personal lens with me about how God used grief in my brokenness to not only transform me, but to really nurture me and to shield me from so many things. And so for those, if this is your first time even watching me or listening to a part of my story, I want to talk from the point of when my father died. My father died in 2015. He actually died 4 days after I had a major surgery. And I was able to see him on the day he passed, because that was the first time I was actually released to go somewhere. And my friend had just taken me to my follow-up doctor's appointment because I had been home for 4 days and I needed to go back to the doctor for them just to kind of see how I was doing. And so before that, I went to my parents' home, and then I saw my dad, and he fussed at me, and he was like, "Why are you here? You're not supposed to be here." But I was like, "It's been so long since I've seen you because of the surgery. I had to come and check on you myself." And I was in excruciating pain, and I could barely function. I could barely stand upright. But I saw my dad, and then a couple hours later, unfortunately, my dad would be dead. And so from that standpoint, there are many points in my grief process that I really had to work through and I recognized. And in hindsight, I realized that my father dying at the time period that he did, two things occurred. Not only did it compound my grief, because I was dealing with so much from a loss. I had quit my job. I was dealing with the loss of my physical capabilities. I was dealing with financial things that were going on in my life. I was dealing with, again, physical health that I felt was lost to me at that particular point. But then I had this thing that I dealt with the loss of my father. my first love, the person who I knew was with me thick and thin through everything, my cheerleader. And so there was a moment that I realized that my grief was so compounded because I was experiencing several things of loss at the exact same time when my father died. But in hindsight, I realized that it also was transformative and a part of my blessing to be able to deal with my grief when the point that my father died. You see, I am a very active individual, not necessarily physically active, although I am that, but I'm a very active individual, and everything that I take on, I'm taking charge of things. I'm running ish. I'm doing all of these things. I'm juggling multiple tasks. But when this happened in my life, I was at such a point that I was so broken. I literally was already dependent on individuals. I couldn't physically move many times. People had to help move my body and move different things with me. But when my father died, I realized this placed me in a point where I was so dependent on God, as well as the people that he put into my life to nurture me and to shield me and to assist me. I was so dependent because I physically couldn't do all of the things to get caught up in activities. And if you've lost anyone in grief, or if you understand when you've lost someone, you have the funeral, the activity of the moment that takes place. But then after that, there's kind of like, what's next? Well, many people, after the what next and all of those things happen, what they find themselves in is they get so caught up in the activities that they don't necessarily know how to process and deal with grief. But one of the things that helped me is that because I was so isolated during that time period, I was so broken, I was already so dependent on things that I couldn't do anything except sit there with God, as I realized that he had to be able to help me, because I was already physically broken, mentally and emotionally broken. But he was going to use this as a standpoint to be able to build and transform me on all levels, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically as well. I was in my cave moment, much like Elijah was in his cave moment. And so when you look at this particular scripture, there's a couple of different things that we need to be able to talk about. Number one is that Elisha, in the midst of these things, he was provided for and nurtured by angels. The angels came to him, they woke him up, they took care of him, the angel fed him, prepared a meal for him, gave him water to be able to sustain him during the time period of what his grief was at that bottom moment, and all of the moments when he just felt like he was done, he couldn't do anything. He was overwhelmed by grief, depression, darkness, everything. In this moment, God sent an angel to provide for and to nurture Elijah. And so if you're in grief, I want you to recognize, or if you've experienced it, that God will send and provide for you from people and from his direct hand, the ability and the capability to give you to nurture you, and to provide for you. But not only does this text show us that, we also see within this particular text that Elijah was shielded in this. He was shielded in a cave, not only from the preeminence of God, because how many of you know that we can rage against God when we are grieving and we are experiencing things? So many people call God out of his name. They disparage God on so many different levels when we are experiencing grief, of which I too am. I never really went 100% went left with God, but there were moments that I was there that I raged against him. But even in that, God doesn't act out in response to our grief and our rage against him with his wrath. Instead, he gives us the blessings of his grace. And so Elijah, when he was in the cave, he was shielded by the preeminence of God. He was shielded by the wind, the tumbling rocks, the earthquake, the fire. He was shielded by all of that from the preeminence of God. But also recognize that, again, I started off by saying, if you're reading all of 1 Kings chapter 19, that Elijah was running away. So he was in this cave. Not only was he being shielded in this cave, but he was also being shielded from the enemies, those who were looking for him and those who wanted to kill him because of everything he had stood for and everything that he had done in the name of God. And so when we look at this particular scripture, we're able to see that not only was Elijah provided for and nurtured by an angel, he was also shielded on two ways. Again, shielded from his enemies, but then also shielded in such a way that what he was doing and how he was speaking, he was shielded from the preeminence and presence of God. But God still allowed him to recognize that he was there, because in the of it. It's my alarm. It's probably going to go off again. But then the last thing I want to point out then is the transformation. So what does the transformation have to do with this text? Well, I didn't go into the latter parts of chapter 19 when it comes to the other verses, but this is something that you have to recognize. The angel said to Elijah, and the second time when the angel said, he was like, eat, because you must be prepared for the journey. So not only did the angel bring food to be able to nurture Elijah, the angel was bringing food for Elijah to be able to be nurtured and ready for the journey ahead. It was for preparation. It was for transformation. And so as God was speaking to Elijah in the cave and in these moments, and he was saying, what are you doing here? What I didn't read was the other part was when God then gave Elijah the charge, because he was preparing him for the transformation to be able to leave that cave, to go and to be able to transfer his mantle to Elisha then thereafter. And so what does that mean? Elijah was going from not only a prophet of God, he was going to be transformed to a prophet and a trainer of the next prophet that was to be able to come. There was a period of transformation that was going on there. And so when I look at my life and when I look at everything that have occurred to me after my father's died, I can't tell you how many times I was in a phase of transition. And so I just want to talk and tell you just about a quick little story about how God actually shielded me. I don't share this story with many people, but it is a part of my grief journey. And so many people don't recognize that grief can actually manifest in numerous ways. It took years for me to be able to heal in so many ways, to even be able to have this conversation to talk about my father's death. But one of the things that I had to recognize, and that someone told me of how I was grieving and that I was actually still grieving, was not too long after my father died. I was at a point that, again, I had been homebound for so long because of my body, that we were having my homecoming, my alumni weekend in Austin, Texas. And so I was going to go to my alumni weekend in Austin, Texas, and I was going to finally just be able to let go and have fun. But that weekend also was the same weekend that I had an obligation at church. And I'm a minister, and I felt just this overwhelming crush on me to be able to perform and to do everything that I had always done beforehand. And this is also a part of my transformation and why I wanted to share this story with you, because I was always a person to show up and to show out, to handle business, to be able to do things, to juggle things, whatever I needed to be able to do. I was doing it, I was handling, and I was executing at, if not a 10, darn near at a 10. You couldn't knock me off my game. But during this time period, I had this church obligation to be at, and then I also had something that I wanted to personally do for myself. So I went to Austin. I had a good time with my friends, and I went to, we left from being out at one of our homecoming or alumni parties. I got back to the hotel room with my friends. Mind you all, I'm on crutches. I'm on crutches. I can't really move well. But we get back to the hotel, and I literally wake up at like 4:30 in the morning after having been home in the hotel a couple of hours. I wake up and I prepare to drive back to Dallas because I had this obligation when it comes to church. But I had so much resentment in me at that moment because I was tired of being a perfectionist. I was tired of showing up for everybody and everything. I was tired of myself. There were so many things that I was just like, God, why? And so I did all of those things. I remember driving back to Dallas literally for 2.5 hours. I cried the entire way with my best friend, and I was just so angry and mad and resentful because I felt that I had to be able to show up at this certain level of perfection when it came to ministry and all the obligations and things that I said that I was gonna do, not realizing that part of this was grief. And so when I got to that ministry meeting with my pastor, and he was like, what are you doing here? I thought you were going out of town. I said, I did. I just drove back so I could attend this meeting. I'm leaving to go back in a couple of hours. And he looked at me and he said, you are grieving. You need to stop and you need to slow down. And I rejected that. I was like, what? I mean, I know I'm in a period of grief, but this is not grieving. He was like, you're grieving. And I want to just give an aside here that if you don't have a spiritual authority in your life to be able to speak to and through your pain, I encourage you to be able to find someone that can be able to do that, because in that moment it was a breaking that was happening to me that I was not even realizing when he spoke that to me, because I had to settle down that think I may be grieving right now. What I think is the burden of expectations that I'm dealing with is also mirrored with the burden of the grief that I was experiencing. And so from that, I actually left, got back on the road with friends, drove back to Austin in that same day. And when I got there for the homecoming celebrations, this is the part that most people wouldn't share with you, but I'm open. So I got there, and when I was there, I started drinking, and I started drinking, and I started drinking. Now, I'm not a person that actually drinks a lot. I don't. I go through spurts of times when I drink. I didn't drink in all of college. I really didn't actually become probably a social drinker maybe until my 30s. And so I've never been a big person when it comes to alcohol. But this day I kept drinking, so much so that I got drunk and I got sick. And when we got back to the hotel room, I remember being so sick that I was vomiting. And then my friends, and at this point, I love them to this day, they came in and swooped around me. Like, they protected me. No one knew that I was drunk. No one knew that I was sick. They took me to the back of the hotel in order for me to be able to come in through the back door. Because also, remind you, I'm in ministry. What does this look like from an outside perspective? I'm sure someone could have condemned me and said, what is she doing? You know, she's a minister of the gospel. She's a preacher. How can she be looking like this out here, not recognizing I was grieving? And so my friends all saw that God used them in such a manner that they protected me, that they shielded me. But then at that moment, I really realized how I had to deal with some things for me. And so from that, I recognized that I had to move past the level of other people's expectations on me and the pressure that I felt. God used that entire time period of grief, of coming off the pinnacle of doing things for other people and even doing things for God, to talk to me about relationship, to talk to me about what grief was looking like and how it was manifesting in my life. And so from that, so much changed in my life. How I relate to other people, how I relate to myself. I was transformed. I don't allow expectations to dictate my life and my actions anymore like it did in the past. There was so much transformation that came from that period of brokenness and grief for me. And even then, I want you to recognize it was a process. I'm a driven person. I remember prior to my father passing away, I could stay up to 1, 2 in the morning, writing books, responding to emails, working, again, being at this driven level of excellence. But after that, it took nearly 5 years. Actually, I want to say 5, 6 years for me to even be able to get back into that mode, because I simply didn't care anymore, or it just simply wasn't in me. Something had changed. Although now I do work in a different way, not nearly at that level that I was in the past, because there was some transformation and some things that God had to deal with me about. But I want you to recognize that so much can come from your level of brokenness, your level of grief, that God can use it to nurture you and to be able to transform you. And so one final thing about my life and just my journey, and that I want to be able to just tell you about, is that I remember when COVID hit. It also was the same time that my childhood asthma decided to manifest into my adulthood. And I remember going to the doctor and it's like, hey, I'm having these breathing issues and all of these things. And they were doing x-rays and they were like, man, hello. Okay, sorry. They were like, ma'am, it looks like it's fine. And I'm like, no. And I remember a doctor telling me, it was like, perhaps you just have anxiety because of everything's going on. And although I respect any individuals that may have experienced anxiety with COVID, I stopped her dead in her tracks. Because number one, she wasn't going to speak something on me that was untrue. But number two, I was like, no, ma'am, COVID, this this is not affecting me how it may be affecting other people. You see, because I had already been at the level of rock bottom for me, that my lens was different when COVID started, and then even during COVID. And so my experience of it was a little bit different. I didn't have the anxiety that a lot of people may have had when it came to COVID, again, because I had already been so broken before. And so God had used that time period to build me up and prepare me for the journey, just as the angels was preparing Elijah for the journey that was ahead of him, as he was going to become a prophet and to be able to train Elisha. And so I looked at that because I recognized that even all that I have experienced with my grief and in those moments, it prepared me for the years that were to come, the years that I'm experiencing right now, the COVID and the situations that were happening in the world, because I experienced so much that God shielded me. He protected me. He nurtured me, but he also transformed me. And so lastly, I'm going to wrap this up and just be able to say, regardless of what process or part of grief that you're in and that you find yourself in, understand and know that it is also one of transformation. Grief will transform you. You will no longer be the person that you were before and after you've lost a person. No longer the same person that you were after you've lost an ideal, after you may have lost your job. Your identity has shifted and changed. If you've miscarried, you've lost your health. You are no longer the same person when you encounter grief, when you're on the other side. There is a change that happens, but understand, even with that change, it is a level of transformation, and that no matter how broken you are, literally and figuratively, for me, I was both of them, God will nurture you, he will shield you, and he will use it as an opportunity to transform you. And why and how do I know this? Because in Romans 8, and I want to think it's Romans 8 and 23, but Romans 8, maybe it's 29. Romans 8 tells us that all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord. He will use this period and time period of grief for you to transform you to something and someone that you may not have known, but that you were always supposed to be. Thank you so much for this Wednesday word, for joining me on this journey, that I hope it did bless you and help you wherever you may be. Thank you. Bye-bye.